Welcome everyone to today's MOOC session on when UI and API testing meets service virtualization, a paradigm shift for continuous testing. Before we begin, let me first introduce you to our hosts for this session. My name is Lydia Wazir, and I am a training consultant at the Tricentis Academy. Joining me today is Robert Wagner, who is one of our knowledgeable product managers for API testing and service virtualization. Robert has been with Tricentis for over 9 years. Before we start looking at how UI, API, and service virtualization work perfectly together in Tricentis Tosca, let me first discuss some general housekeeping rules for those joining us for the first time. Please note that all participants will be muted during the session. As there are many of you currently attending, everyone talking would be confusing and hard to follow. There is a control panel at the bottom of your screen with apps you can toggle on or off, key ones being Q&A, Twitter, Share, and the media player. Even though you are muted, we do encourage you to ask questions during the session. Please use the Q&A box. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the MOOC, and we will hold the most interesting questions for the question and answer session so that everyone can profit from the answers. We will try to answer as many questions as possible during this session, but please be aware that only questions related to the current topics will be covered. Please also keep in mind that given the number of attendees, we might not be able to answer all of your questions during the session. Lastly, this session will be recorded and will be shared on our website later this week. As always, if you stay with us till the end of the session, you'll receive vouchers for 2 free courses in a separate email after the session is over. I will now hand over to Robert, who will introduce us to this interesting topic.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, I'm Robert. I'm responsible for API testing and service virtualization. And I want to speak how these two topics work perfectly together, and especially also when it comes to UI testing. And this is really a paradigm shift for continuous testing, because we will see that we can reuse a lot of test artifacts, even for different teams, and share it all across the company. But before I do a demo and hands-on in our products, I want to give you a short overview about what we understand with test-driven service virtualization. For those of you guys who are familiar with Tosca, you guys know that Tosca basically executes tests from a client perspective. Like in my screen here on the left side, it could be a UI test case, an API test case, file, batch, or any other technology which does some input on a system on a test. Which means A, in this case, is our system on a test, and when we ever do some input on the system on a test, it can potentially send some requests to a backend system, which is in our case a CRM, a rating, or an order service. So with Tosca, you can do the UI testing, and I'm pretty sure you have seen this already somewhere, or just check out the other MOOCs where you can find more details about UI testing and also for API testing. But we are focusing also in this course on service virtualization, and we basically can put OSV in between our system on a test and the required backend systems, which means we can record the traffic, and in case these systems are not there yet, we could also create this from scratch by, for instance, scanning a whistle, a rumble, or any other definition, depending on the service in the backend. And once we've recorded it, we'll be able to replay it or simulate these messages with OSV, which means we can pick up, for instance, a request, we analyze it, and OSV will then generate a response in order to mimic the real system behavior, for instance, like the CRM service. Or in another case, for instance, we can include functions which are not there yet. For instance, we have a rating service and it's be extended with additional functionality, but it's not there in the real application. We can model it in our service virtualization product. We will see this how this looks like in the demo afterwards. And of course, you also can not only include functions, you also can do more like variants or test data, add them to the backend services in order to test deeper, and you can share also these test artifacts all across your teams. Because we will see, for instance, that if you implement a service-oriented architecture component, you will always have a couple teams involved which have different goals and different obstacles. So this is what we understand with test-driven service virtualization, which means Tosca does the input on the system on a test, and OSV is virtualizing the backends. So when we speak about collaboration across teams, it's not only that we have a common repository where we can share test artifacts, it's also that we can, for instance, reverse calls. Like in this case, Tosca performs like in the example before to the system on a test, and this triggers some requests and responses in the backend, but we then can reverse these messages and not use it for virtualization, but for API testing. Which means in the first scenario, we virtualize that we can test our application on a test system A, sorry. And then we have system B, C, and D as well, and we can use the captured messages and reverse them and fire them against the remaining systems on the other side, which is the backend. All right, so let's move into the tool, into Tosca. And I've prepared an example for you, which is our insurance calculator application. And what you see here, it's basically set up. It has a user frontend, which runs in the browser. And whenever you trigger something in the browser, it will fire some calls to the backend. And in our example, we have team 1, and therefore I've prepared also already a couple of UI test cases. And these UI test cases will be executed on the user in frontend. But the problem is, if the backend does not behave as we expect, that we run into issues when we try to execute, for instance, this process, which consists in the first step: select a vehicle or a car, select a customer, save a customer, and so on and so forth. So our test focus for team 1 is to test the front end. And the problem is that backend does not always respond as we expected. And whoever did some test automation up front on the UI level, if the backend is not doing what the front-end automation requires, this is a potential blocker that our automation breaks. And which means with a lot of these potential showstoppers, continuous testing is very hard to achieve and probably actually impossible. For instance, in our example, I have the order engine, for instance. If it has a bug, it potentially causes a different behavior when we execute our UI test case. And we will have then false errors, for instance, and we will have more investigation efforts, even our system was completely fine. Or for instance, the rating service has some test data containing we are not expecting. For instance, we persisted a customer, or we saved a customer yesterday already, then we cannot save it twice probably, and this will cause a different flow in our automation. Or for instance, in our CRM service is currently under maintenance and does not respond at all. Then we cannot get, for instance, over these customer steps. Or for instance, another example could be if the vehicle service is a third-party service and they charge us for every time we are sending a call to the system, like $100. Then in many cases the testing will be have to walk around this, because the testing will just be too expensive to be executed like with every check-in. So these are potential blockers, and I created up front UI test case here, and for those guys who have did the MOOCs about UI testing, they should be familiar. In Tosca, you have everything in steps where certain values are inserted into the user interface, and by executing all these steps, we're basically completing the process I just described in my screens before. All right, so before I start, I want to introduce you first into our Tricentis monitor. The Tricentis monitor is basically just for our demo application, a backend system where I can switch on and switch off certain services in order to simulate some unstable behavior systems. For instance, it does not belong to the Tricentis products, but we're using it for our demos. All right, and we've seen DOS command already. So that's the OSV monitor, and in the OSV monitor I will see if I have uploaded something. I also can configure, for instance, endpoints, and this is what I did here. I created here an environment, and this environment contains the so-called service ports. And I've created service ports for my car service, for my SAM service, for my rating service, and for the order service. And these services are HTTP based. They're listening on this port, and they will redirect, for instance, call to the real application, which is basically exactly these endpoints here. So I have 60,005, for instance, for the order service. And as soon as I've configured a real service, it is possible for OSV to forward these messages to the real service, pick up the response, and to record and capture the traffic in between these applications. So let me just minimize a little bit this application, and let's open the browser. And I will navigate now to my system under test, which is the insurance calculator service. And when I click on get on quote, it brings me to the starter page, where we have to do the first inputs, for instance, the vehicle make, for instance. And if I turn down, for instance, the car service, and I would choose this option, then I can see here I cannot access these controls here, and I also get like an error that this service cannot be reached. So that's a problem if we want to do automated testing, because at this stage our automated test case would expect to have some numbers of seeds, but it doesn't. But what we can do here is we can capture the traffic once the service is up and running, or we can create it also from scratch. But in this example, I will record it, and therefore I simply activate the start recording button here in OSV, and when I pick, for instance, Volkswagen, I can see here on the backend it receives the call to the backend, and it also OSV has captured, for instance, the two messages. And when I stop recording, I just double click this, and I can see that I captured, for instance, the request from Volkswagen to the backend, and the backend responded, for instance, with the make, with seeds, and the full types which are provided, for instance, for Volkswagen. And so I can verify this on UI level. So what I will execute now the full test case, and I will activate the recording here in OSV, and OSV will capture the whole traffic, and it will help us later on to replay the whole testing on the UI without the need for the backend, which makes us pretty much independent from broken backend services, as I described initially in the first introduction. All right, so let's execute the test case. I will start recording now, and I should see whenever messages are captured in my backend. So it should open the browser now. Here we go. So the test case navigates through the application. It's picking Volkswagen, for instance. We can see the call on the right side in the monitor. We can see a couple of more calls. Okay, so the test case has been executed. And we can see we have in our OSV monitor, we've captured 14 messages. So the test case went through, which means the backend was there and then we had a good day. But from now on, even if the backend is not available, we can still continue to test our UI because we have captured the messages in OSV. And in order to make this work, I will now import these messages into OSV. Therefore, I switch to the ribbon, click on record stateful, because I need a stateful scenario, because I also have to say, for instance, a customer, or whenever something needs to be changed from a test data perspective, for instance, or a certain flow needs to be followed, we treat this as a stateful scenario, while request and response pairs are very limited to input and output behavior for request and response only. So let me import this. It asks me if I want to clear the recorded messages. And here it is asking me if I would like to have the business parameter created automatically. And this is a early adopter feature for 11.0. You can activate it in the Tosca options. But by default, it's not activated. But what it will do, I will show you later. And I click yes. So what I get here now is this scenario. These are the same messages I just imported and recorded from OSV. And if I click on a sequence flow, it shows me as well the sequence which has been generated while executing my UI test case. And we had some funny situations there at customers, for instance, when we did like a pilot demo, for instance, where the customers have realized that the flow is actually not the same as they were expecting it. So you can use also this feature to do like reverse engineering of your backend systems. You can print this, for instance, as PDF and so on and so forth, and can have a closer look on these message flows. But yeah, having that said, we can upload these OSV scenario to OSV again. Why we're even importing this to Tosca? It is because the whole maintenance is done inside Tosca. So we get also modules here. We get like these so-called scenarios, which are basically contained in test cases. But from there, you can link it to requirements. You can link it to test case design or execution lists and so on and so forth. So that's why we bring it into Tosca Commander. We also have a feature to push it directly into OSV. But I will not have a look at this in this MOOC session today. All right, so let's deploy this scenario in OSV. We can see we have this scenario available here now. And yeah, the scenario which just uploaded is live as soon as it's uploaded. And I can rerun my test case without the need for the backend systems anymore. So I can now turn off, for instance, VCRM or rating service, for instance, and the whole test case should run even without the backend services available. Okay, so let me run this test case again. So just look on the right side. Maybe I'm clearing the log up front. So there shouldn't be any log entries now for the backend. All right. So the test case has been completed. We checked and verified all controls we wanted to verify, even we had no backend available. And this is what we call test case driven service virtualization, which means we have our service virtualization, which follows this flow. And the test case, it serves this test case, for instance, which exactly creates a quote. And if we want to do this for delete order, for instance, or for search order, we just would do the same. Just execute the test case, enable recording, and then import it to Tosca, upload, and replay it. But let's have a look in more detail on the scenarios here. For instance, I have reshaped the basically the same scenario I just recorded, but I put, for instance, some folders around it, and I give it better speaking names, for instance, so it looks more nice. And that's not all what I did. I also did, for instance, I added here also verification points, which means in OSV, if you have a look at the scenario, in the very first step, we have action mode, which is called wait on. This means whenever a message comes in to the resource with car service, OSV will detect this. It will buffer a session ID, and it will verify if Volkswagen was the make. And as soon this pattern matcher was true, it will respond exactly with the message as we designed it here. Maybe we have a look at the recorded example from before. We will see that we only have the session ID in here. But when I switch to the technical view, I can see that I have a payload in here. So if I right-click jump to module, I can use the pretty print function, so I can read it a little better. I can mark, for instance, in the payload what I want to use, and I click, for instance, add as business parameter. So what then is happening is I, for instance, add some business parameters, and by using these business parameters, I can parameterize my scenario for different situations. For instance, if I go here and I would not use Volkswagen, but for instance BMW, and let me just complete the values by clicking on values. For instance, you could also paste a message from clipboard, which has the same structure. But let me switch, for instance, to the technical view. So what you see here then is the make has changed to BMW. This means you record the scenario and you can add additional fields in as business parameters. And once you have business parameters available, you can set here any name you like. For instance, I will just switch to any. When I switch to technical view, I will see I have any in here. So you have only one module and one test case, but you can link it, for instance, a test data source, and can create a lot of different variations for your service. And for instance, if you want to remove this seed, for instance, you can simply remove it. And what happens, it also vanishes from the payload. So you also can organize your payload dynamically. All right, so having said this about the business parameters, you basically can type in any values. You can do random functions, anything, or date functions, anything you need, anything you know from Task or from Tbox can be used here as well. So you can see here for get person, for instance, the session identifier identifies again the scenario, and it verifies, for instance, first name and last name. We could potentially also buffer the value here and insert here as a buffer value again. And also the whole flow basically can be changed and remodeled as you need it. For instance, you can move and you say you want to have the CRM service should come after the CRM rating. That's fine too. You don't need to program or code it. It's all drag and drop and copy paste. But let me upload this to OSV again. And let me remove the previous scenario. We see we have now this scenario available here. And I will execute my UI test case now step by step. All right, here it is. So let's go to the product data. And I will run this in my sketchbook, and in the meantime we will stop, and then we will have a look in the OSV monitor and see what's going on in the monitor. All right, it should stop here now. We will execute the rest later. And in the available tab is everything which is available, but it has not been started, which means that's logic which is available in OSV, and you can upload all kind of scenarios. And if you switch to the pending tab, you will see that there is currently a scenario pending. Why we introduced this pending? Because some of these scenario flows can last even for days. If you think about banking and in the financial sector, sometimes you have like settlement dates, and sometimes these scenarios are pending for even days. Then OSV will keep track of it. And of course, also if you have like scheduled messages, then these messages remain in a scheduled status. They will lie in a database until the scheduled date has been reached, and then the message will be sent and the scenario will be continued. But we see on top here already that we have as an aggregated result an error. So let me expand this, and we can see the problem did not happen in step 1 or 2, but in step number 3 we obviously have a problem. And I can now drill into this by clicking scenario details. And when I jump to step number 3, I can see that, for instance, first name was expected to be Gerard, but the received value was Jon Snow. So which means the virtualization worked fine, but the values were different to the ones we were inserting. But of course, in this example, we just had wrong test data, but just consider this, for instance, if like uppercase, lowercase verification, for instance, has some unexpected, or for instance, state formats, verification is quite easy by doing this. And we don't need to have a look in step 4, but in step number 5, we have the same problem. The birthday is fine, also the engine performance, but again, the user is wrong. And we can see the problem is consistent over the whole process. If we did some verification, some more verification, that's totally fine. You also can upload, for instance, XSD schemas, and which means if there is a problem from a validation perspective, it will be also in here listed as an error. And we can see here the scenario is still pending. Step 11 to 14 have not been executed yet. And we could now set it manually to some status and put it into completed tab where we have the previous scenario, which was fine, but we had no verification points in there. You can see that here, there were no verification points. But let me just continue the remaining steps. So with the price option, which means we can simply continue the test case. It should bring the browser now in the foreground, and it will complete the order. All right. So when I click here on refresh, I can see I have this scenario activate order. By the way, you can drag and drop these columns on here, and then you can see you have more or less like a filter. You also can, for instance, filter for certain values, or you can insert some verifications. You should give it a try. At least when you have like a couple hundreds or thousands of messages processed, this is very helpful for error investigation or for sorting for searching and filtering the right messages. All right, so we see that we have also a problem in the very almost last step, in step number 13, and I can check, but it's again the same issue. You can see also error investigation is very effortless. It aggregates the result, for instance, on top, so you would not, for instance, have to investigate successful processed messages. Just drill down where you need to know where the problem was. All right, so that's about service virtualization. And as already mentioned, from here, the story continues as you're probably familiar with Tosca. Link it to requirements, link it to test case design, and so on and so forth. And you can see here as well, also the OSV scenarios don't look too technical. Even In the background, for instance, let me just have a look for the order service, which is a little more complex than the rest. If you switch to the technical view, you simply will have, for instance, in the technical view, the representation of the XML. It could be, of course, also text or JSON. And by navigating with the business parameters, you see exactly which values have been verified or where these business parameters are pointing to. The idea behind these business parameters is also only to expose the functional relevant parts, and business parameters can be created for any field here. You can create business parameters for methods, endpoints, resources, HTTP headers, but also params, which are more relevant, of course, for REST services. Okay, so let's continue with our story. So we could now eliminate these potential continuous testing breakers by simulating the whole system with OSV. So team 1 can do continuous testing from now, and they have for the backend for their test cases completely in their control. They can adopt it, can enrich it with different variations, and so on and so forth. But the problem is, who is testing teams 2 business logic now? And these guys need to test their system as well, but for them, the UI probably is the showstopper. But what they can do is, and like in my introduction, I was talking about team collaboration and reusing artifacts. So what we've just recorded can be reversed for API test cases. So that's really a cool function, because remember, we created this for our service virtualization purpose, and we can take it simply now and convert it into an API test case. You see, you have the host scenario I captured during recording. I have now also available for API testing, which means the team 2, which is the backend team, or also the API gateway team or the enterprise service bus team, but whoever who is responsible for the gateway or for the business layer, they can use exactly the same flow the UI team just captured by executing their UI test case. So there's no need for modeling this manually, but like in this case, in OSV, we had to buffer the session ID, and I will change this now to insert, and I will generate a random ID, like in this case. I could also insert a fixed value, but let's generate a 10-digit random number. And in the response, I need to simply buffer this session ID, because the service will return it, we will buffer it, and here we will just insert it. And that's basically it. And there are a couple more, for instance, for saving person. I've prepared an example where I completed this already, but from a testing perspective, and if we have a look at the modules, these are modules and test cases which should be able to be executed as they are. For instance, yeah, let me just run this against our application here, but of course I need to turn on the backends because we want to test now the backends. So let me run this. And why doing API tests for backend testing? The reason is quite simple. You can execute them earlier. They are much faster, as you can see here. These were executed now within a couple seconds, while the UI test case, for instance, runs much longer, and of course is also usually not that stable as, for instance, API test cases are. And as already mentioned, I would, for instance, have to create like the ID, because the expected value I had in there has been generated while I was capturing the initial question, and the actual value is this one. So we probably need to update our test case in order to have the right verification here. Like in this case, so we probably will have buffer the ID here, and then we need to save we need to use the order ID, which is buffered. So I'm calling a buffer here. That's how you insert the buffer. And it should be now run through without any verification issues. Okay. Okay, we have also in the last response, we forgot, for instance, to add also this verification number here. So I need to add this as well. Yeah. Tosca just tells you what you did wrong, and this is quite easy to find out. Let me run it again, and now it should be great. Here we go. So what we did is we took the captured scenario, we converted with one click into an API test case, and which means these guys can also test their backend system with every check-in regression, for instance, out of the efforts Team A did for service virtualization. And that's pretty cool that these artifacts and these test cases can so easily be reused for also testing the opposite system. And this is very valuable for testing service-oriented architectures, especially when you want to do continuous testing. And this is also some kind of an integration upfront before these systems first time meet each other. And this helps also to do a lot better results when you go, for instance, into integration or system integration stage. I have prepared also like a real world example I've captured recently in a pilot. So this is a system, a microservice-based system behind an API gateway, for instance, and this is only the login procedure, and of course also OSV is also capable to do flows like this. All right, so that's it from my perspective now from service virtualization, recording it, convert it into an API test case. And what I will do now is, you may wonder how this works, for instance, if Team 2 does not have a recording in place or a service in place which cannot be recorded at all. And therefore, we have the so-called API scan. The API scan is required to do some initial checks on certain systems. For instance, let me remove this. So what I will do now is I can scan, for instance, the CRM service. You can scan, for instance, here a WSDL, a RAML file, and so on. And what you can do here is you can simply do some trial and error on a quite light-based API scan. The guys who've seen the API testing MOOC should be already familiar with this, but I want to show this to you guys because it is also quite interesting to use this for service virtualization. For instance, if you have like a CRM service and you have some test data to generate, I will simply import this as an API test case into Tosca. I can simply create my business parameters, as you have seen before already. I will set a verification point as well here on the customer result. So let me remove this. And I also have here now empty hull of a test case, which I could fill in. So there is no XML code here involved, so you can hand this over also to people which are not so familiar with XML, JSON, or all the rest stuff, or even OData, for instance. And you can link this to a test data sheet. Well, let me just copy this into my folder here. For instance, I have some CRM test data in here. and I want to link this to my template, and therefore I simply convert it into a template, the test case into a template, and drag and drop this on my template. I can see here I get all the external references which reference into my sheet, and of course I want to verify if the creation was true or successful. And I want to give you a hint, because your test case instances will look much nicer if you use like this feature. There is a property called instance name, and if you insert, for instance, the external reference, it will have the same value, for instance, as the value had from your data sheet. So we'll call this last name, which means if I instantiate this now, I get like test cases for all the guys I had in my test sheet. Okay, and by putting these external reference, the Excel references in my properties, I also get much better speaking names about my test cases, and I should be able now to run this against my CRM service for test the CRM service, for instance, or for generating test data. And this is the reason why you should do it with the API engine, because it's much faster compared to using UI. But a good thing here is it's not only possible to do API tests now. You can convert this again into a OSV scenario. And if you do the instantiation here of this OSV scenario, we see that we get like service virtualization stubs for all the employees. So this means when I upload this now to OSV, I have a virtual CRM service available. Let me give a try. Let's check it out in OSV. We can see that we have also all the scenarios I've just generated here available. And let me just drill down to Max Mustermann. You can see here in the request we have all wait-ons, which means it will check in the inbound messages for these, and then it will return, for instance, true. And I'm quite lazy, so I'll just picking this request from the preview, and I will paste it simply into my API scan. I just want to check, and I will send it against this endpoint, which is 10,003, just for you guys to make clear where I'm sending this. That's the CRM service, and it is listening on 10,003. That's why I switched it. We have a couple of possibilities to do this. You can check up the knowledge base. You can redirect, as I did here now, the endpoint, or you use like an HTTP proxy, but of course this is limited for HTTP only. But for GMS you would need again a GMS proxy queue, or you can redirect, for instance, certain calls on system level. But ask your technical stuff, or just Google how to redirect calls from a local machine to another endpoint. That's something you can configure on system level. But when I send this now to OSV, I can see already message generated by Tosca orchestrated service virtualization. So I can fire this a couple times, and I will see here in my completed scenario tab that I'm using it. I can see this calls I just triggered also here in my completed tab. So this is how you can create messages from step, for instance, import it as an API test case or a service virtualization, link it to a test data sheet, convert it as you like it. And that's pretty much it from my demo. And I have 2 slides at the end where I just will recap this in a couple of sentences. And then that's it for my MOOC today. What we're trying to achieve with this is the agile shift left approach. Means when you're in a very early stage and you have like a system A, this could be a browser app, this could be a mobile app. In Tricentis, we support all kind of technologies. Virtualize the surrounding systems. Remove the obstacles you're facing which hinder you to do continuous testing. Run this with every check-in. Because it's 100% simulated, you can perform it every check-in and no data is persisted and you have the system completely under your control. OSV is yours. So you're not relying on other systems anymore. And if you move into a next stage, you can be pretty sure that your system has been tested very well and you do some crucial integrations, for instance, with system B. But you do this like every sprint. If you have like in your application new functionality which is mandatory introduced in system A and system B, of course you will have to check it against the real system B. But if system B, for instance, is testing the same way you are testing this, you will have much better results. And as already mentioned, team E, for instance, can share the messages captured, for instance, with team B in order to do API testing. So the success rate will be very high, and this is also what we see with our customers. Which means when you move into a later stage, for instance, end-to-end testing or user acceptance testing, you will experience a much better system behavior and much better stability of your systems. Because you have like component tested your systems in a very detailed way. And you should do in these late stages of your testing process exploratory testing and this kind of stuff. You can still virtualize third-party systems, but ideally you don't have service virtualization in place here anymore. Because in an ideal world there would be no service virtualization as well, and if you could, probably you would test in production. But since it's not always possible, I think that's the best approach you can choose. And when you go into production, you should face less issues, of course. And I want to give you a real world example at the end of my MOOC. When I used to be a tool maker and a technical draftsman, we were visiting the BMW factories somewhere around here in Upper Austria. And what I've seen there, this was already in the 90s. They were producing engines for BMW, and they had like robots picking up the freshly assembled engines, and these robots were driving through the whole manufacturing plant and testing these engines autonomously. And they were plugging in these engines into testing stations, and you can consider this the same way what we do with OSV. We surround the system on a test, which is in this case the engine, but in your case the application you're developing, and you simulate input behavior and you measure output behavior, and you test it in a very detailed and very complex way. Even if it's stateful, even if it's consuming this data, this can be all simulated. And as soon your application has no verification or problems anymore, you move to the next stage, which in this case probably would be this engine would be shipped into the next manufacturing plant where they assemble the full vehicle and then they do a test drive. I'm pretty sure they do not put untested or broken engines into vehicle bodies, and so you guys should not do this either. Okay, so that's it from my perspective. So I'll hand over to Lydia. And
Thank you, Robert. This was amazing. It's really fascinating to hear how you have packed years of experience into 1 hour.
thanks for that. I hope I did not overwhelm you, but you can always send us questions and so on and so forth.
Exactly. So we're now at the point where we can answer some of your questions. And as I mentioned earlier, we did keep a few questions from the session to answer at the end of the presentation so that everyone can profit from the answers. So let's go to the first question. Number 1, do you support OData protocol and SAP?
Oh yeah, OData is very heavily used for SAP systems, especially the HANA platform. And yeah, we support, for instance, definition, scanning of OData files, but the communication basically is based on HTTP, and but yeah, we support it. We can also simulate full SAP gateways, which means, you know, if you have like an business logic in SAP, we also can simulate this with OSV or test it with our API engine.
Excellent. This brings us to our second question. How is OSV licensed?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. We had many different approaches in the past, but now we switched to a completely concurrent user approach, which means if you open Tosca and you have the OSV add-on installed, it consumes one concurrent user license, which means if you close the application, another user can use, for instance, the license, and the same is for the monitor, which means we have the designer licenses where you model and maintain, for instance, these scenarios. But if you open the monitor, you have execution license. And with the execution license is also concurrent user base, but you only can check out, for instance, what is going on OSV, check results, trigger messages, and so on and so forth. But it's all concurrent user based.
Great, thanks for that. And this brings us to our third question from the viewers. Do you support API gateways? And if yes, which one?
We don't really officially support API gateways, but remember the example I showed you? This was actually, I think it was RPG, I'm not sure, or some MuleSoft gateway. So it doesn't really matter for us what kind of gateway it is, as long as it is, for instance, a microservice or a RESTful gateway. We support it because we support HTTP, we support all these protocols like params, query, URI params, JSON, XML, SOAP, Swift, and so on and so forth. So we don't really support specific API gateways, but in general, we can say, yeah, we support API gateways, and we can simulate them full, actually. That's it.
Great, thank you. So I guess that brings us to the last question we had. But apologies if we didn't get around to answer your questions, but let me give you some more information for our upcoming MOOCs and where you can submit your questions. Let's see, the next MOOC on licensing in Tricentis Tosca, where and how to get and activate your Tricentis Tosca licenses, will be our first MOOC of the new year on January 10th, 2018. As always, we will have 2 sessions to cover the different time zones, and you can already register for this MOOC on our website. Also, please complete the feedback at the end of this session. We always like to hear what you thought of us. What else is there to do? Let me guide you to where you can seek further assistance. If your questions weren't answered today in our MOOC, let's have a look to see where you may be able to find answers to those questions. You can link with us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and watch our Tosca in a Heartbeat videos. You can check our knowledge base at our support portal. You can contact the training office at academy@tricentis.com. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and goodbye.